Wow, what a great audience of doers working to change the world. You are definitely the audience that I want to give this message to. As a student in the United States in the 1960s, I witnessed the fierce compassion of the civil rights movement, the joining of hands, the meeting of minds, and the braving of hearts inspired me. Like so many others, I was moved by the struggle in Oxford, Mississippi, a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement in the United States. In 1962, an African-American student's plans to enroll at Oxford, Mississippi, sparked the Battle of Oxford. Before the battle was over, federal troops were on site, hundreds were injured, and tragically, 2 people died. But James Meredith was finally able to go to school. Climate justice, which is the subject of my own fierce compassion now, has been described by the civil rights activist Jibril Kassan, one of the Greensboro Four, as the lunch counter moment of the 21st century. He also says of climate change that it's the biggest threat to justice and opportunity our planet has ever seen. I too believe that climate change is the biggest threat to humanity of the 21st century. Climate change is not just an issue of atmospheric science. It's also about human rights. And this is what continues to motivate me to find urgent and fair global responses to the climate crisis. Which is why I was so emotional when the gavel fell on the Paris Agreement last December. The Paris Agreement has been hailed as historic, which it is. The emotion that flooded through the COP venue as it was adopted was quite incredible. People clapped and hugged and cried. And I actually saw a tear in the eye of Al Gore. They did so because whether they were a government minister, a trade union activist, a negotiator, the leader of an endangered small island state, or a social entrepreneur, they had invested so much of themselves in securing the agreement. And beyond the COP venue, millions of people felt part of the outcome. They saw their efforts reflected in the text of the articles. This broad ownership will be the key to turning those words into practical action. Securing a universal and legally binding agreement by over 190 countries to end the fossil fuel era in this century through cooperative action is historic. Prioritizing the most vulnerable people as we forge this path is what can deliver climate justice. 2015 was a significant year for multilateralism, not just because of the Paris Agreement, but also because of Agenda 2030, adopted last September in New York. You'll recall that it commits all members of the United Nations to 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. These goals cut across every sector of the economy and will benefit every part of society. They aim to reach the furthest behind first and leave no one behind as the world makes the transition to sustainability over the next 15 years. Since the 1st of January this year, the SDGs are now part of the domestic agenda of all countries, rich and poor, large and small. They are a global agenda that changes how we do business, and there's a role for social entrepreneurs in reaching every single one of them, from universal access to clean energy and gender equality, to ending hunger and creating peaceful and inclusive societies. And I do realize that I'm speaking to many of you who are already part of the fossil-free future that the Paris Agreement aspires to. I know that many of you are engaged in addressing issues of inequality, whether it's in delivering energy to power development, addressing women's rights, or children's education. And you're doing it in a way that is getting beyond better. But I want you to work fiercer. And fiercer is an Irish word. We use it a lot. I want you to work fiercer. You have to get into a 1.5 degree frame of mind. Before and during the Paris Agreement, the private sector called on the governments of the world to give them the signal to move on climate change. Well, The Paris Agreement is that signal. And the next step for the Paris Agreement is ratification and then implementation. Again, this is where you have a role to play. Let's be aware, even if the plans countries have prepared as part of the Paris Agreement, are implemented in full, we will still be heading for a 3 degrees Celsius warmer world. This would be catastrophic. So the actions of social entrepreneurs around the world can help to make up the shortfall needed to be on course to well below 2 degrees Celsius and heading for a 1.5 degrees Celsius world. Achieving the 1.5 goal means carbon neutrality by 2050. That means leaving 2/3 of the known fossil fuel reserves in the ground, massive investments in forestry, and better land management to enhance carbon sinks. These are all actions many of you are already taking, so let's do it quicker and fairer. By future-proofing every decision we make, we can live within planetary boundaries while ensuring a life free from poverty and full of opportunity for all. The Paris Agreement creates new responsibilities for every one of us. Developing countries have taken on additional responsibilities as part of the agreement. And if they're not supported to deliver on the leadership they're prepared to give, trust in the international process will be severely eroded. We need to implement climate action to build resilience and promote low-carbon development in a way that allows the benefits to be shared equally. So we need to be fierce and bold, but we also need to be compassionate and caring. We need compassion for those most affected by and least responsible for climate change. They're suffering the injustice of climate change every day through water and food shortages, extreme weather events, and the loss of livelihoods. We need fierce determination to protect the planet, to save lives, and to build a low-carbon society that brings the benefits of electricity, transport, enough food, and safe water for everyone. Addressing climate change is not something we can do alone. It requires a global effort and a realization that it's in our collective self-interest to take action. Fierce compassion cannot be delegated. It has to be personal. Fierce compassion is for you as social entrepreneurs, for faith leaders, heads of state, CEOs, civil society leaders, mayors, and parliamentarians. It must be owned and channeled as a force into the actions that each of us take every day. Without compassion, a fierce approach to climate action could be dangerous. Rapid climate action, taken purely to reduce greenhouse gas emission risks, could place vulnerable people at even more risk. If people in vulnerable situations aren't consulted, if their rights aren't respected, and if they're forced to shoulder an unfair burden through the loss of land, natural resources, or cultural heritage, the injustice they live with will be compounded. This is why I focus on justice. Believe me, this is not just me trying to make an already complicated situation even more complicated. At any time of transition, we need to take care that the burdens and benefits of that transition are shared equitably. This is where compassion is critical. We need compassion for those employed in the fossil fuel sector, like the coal miners, who will lose their jobs when we stop burning coal. They need to be treated fairly and assured of income security for their families. We need compassion for those living day-to-day on the front lines of climate change, like Ursula Rakova, who has relocated her community from the Catterick Islands to mainland Papua New Guinea, but who mourns leaving the land of the bones of her ancestors. Women too, like Kathy Jetnil-Kijner and Selena Lem, who are using their voices to protect the future of their home, the Marshall Islands. They need fairness, protection, and compassion in the face of the potential loss of their heritage, their culture, and their homes. We need compassion for those living without electricity and clean cooking, like Constance O'Kellett and those in her village in eastern Uganda. They need to be part of the renewable energy revolution and not left behind, as they have been by the fossil fuel-based growth. You can help and are helping. Many of you are already doing what needs to be done, and I want to encourage you further. You can make sure that as the cost of renewable energy falls further and investment in clean energy sources increases, you use your influence, your business, and your resources to reach those furthest behind first. I've never heard that phrase before at the international level, to reach those furthest behind first. You need to have them at the top of your mind, the 1.3 billion people without electricity, and the 2.6 billion still cooking on open fires. Implementing the Paris Agreement and the SDGs with fierce compassion means reaching these people, many of them women, first. We can lift people out of poverty while we take climate action. We can address inequality through a well-designed zero-carbon revolution, and we can protect people's rights by supporting them to be resilient and to manage the impacts of climate change. But we can only do so if we make a conscious effort to have fierce compassion motivate our actions. We've seen in the past how poorly designed biofuels policies or hydroelectric dams have undermined people's rights and led to conflict. On the other hand, climate action designed with fierce compassion to deliver climate justice will improve lives and provide opportunity for all. So, let me conclude. Be fierce. Be part of the transition to zero-carbon, climate-resilient development. It has started. Help us to accelerate it. If we don't deliver on the promise of Paris, the contract already entered into with the most climate-vulnerable countries and communities, we will lose momentum, break promises, and the agreement itself could flounder. Time is of the essence. Every month and year counts. The sooner we act, the less costly it will be, not just in dollars, but in lives. Be compassionate. Make sure the support you provide is guided every step of the way by human rights and gender equality. A concern for human dignity needs to be at the center of every climate action. Make sure you enable the active and equal participation of men and women from start to finish, and be as transparent and accountable as you are determined and brave. My 5 grandchildren will be in their 40s in 2050, and concern for the world that they will live in certainly gets me out of bed every morning. If we fail to act decisively on climate change, then extreme weather and conflicts for food, water, and even a place to live will mean misery for the 9 billion people sharing the planet in 2050. But if each one of us channels our fierce compassion and uses the resources we have available to us, we can shape a world that is fairer and better than the world we inherited. There's no time to lose. We actually need to link fierce compassion with that phrase of Dr. Martin Luther King when he said, "The fierce urgency of now." The fierce urgency of now. Thank you very much.